everybody, and welcome to another video on my ASMR channel. In this one, it's not really a request, but it's more of, I don't know, I saw a comment on one of my earlier videos about, the one that went over the combat aircraft book and somebody responded where their interest was ships or nautical things. So in this beginning portion of the video, before I get to the main course, I figured I'd go over the various nautical books that I have, or at least some of them. I left out Old Man in the Sea, Kon-Tiki, and Adrift, as those three are indeed nautical, but are really two a fairly different kind of seafaring. Kon-Tiki being a scientific expedition executed to prove that South Americans could have sailed from the Argentinian coast all the way out to the Polynesian Islands and further to the Philippines or something. But it's a great read. Unfortunately, my copy is very well read, and the spine has completely given out, so if I am to present that on camera, it will be with great care. Adrift is a story, well, a true story, following a man's 76 days at sea, adrift, alone after a shipwreck. And Old Man in the Sea is a classic Hemingway novelette detailing an old man coming to terms with his age, I think. I don't know, it's been a while since I read it. But these 5 books are the main ones pertaining to the classic age of sail and military warships. The Log of the Grand Turks here is a bit of a chronicle of some fairly well-known, at least at the time, merchant vessels, titled the Grand Turks, or named the Grand Turks. One book that I do wish I had here is Before the Mast by, I believe, Henry Dana, which is a phenomenal piece. Oh, I also have Moby Dick. I'm currently trying to read that. It's a bit of a challenging read, I'm not gonna lie. But 2 years Before the Mast is something I read while I was in the Navy, and it was a fairly powerful book. I really enjoyed learning about daily life aboard a vessel in the golden age of sail, and how different the California coast was at that time. The Grand Turks, I honestly haven't really read it. As you can see here, there are beautiful illustrations of ports that the Grand Turks had sailed to. I haven't really read much of this, unfortunately. It's one of those books that you buy and say, oh, I'm gonna read this fairly soon, and you kind of forget about it. 1786. Grand Turk Punch Bowl. But these indeed sailed all over. Some cargo manifests, 18 sailors, 4 great guns, 100 count of shot, 10 swords, 10 muskets, and 200 caddies of fire physic or fire powder. But this is indeed a book that I've been meaning to read for the past 10 years probably, and it just kind of collects dust. If anybody's interested in seeing me read some of this, I would be more than happy to, as it's something I've been meaning to read for quite a while. I've read a little bit of this book as well, not a lot. This is a sailor's log, authored by Robley D. Evans, who is a captain. I bought this at a thrift store, so I'm not too sure what all this is about. But here is Robley D. Evans himself from a photograph taken on the bridge of the battleship Iowa. Back when the term battleship was something fairly different to what you may picture today in the age before the HMS Dreadnought. Life in Virginia before the war, with the Indians and buffalo in the Mormon country, a cadet at Annapolis. I'm not going to read the full contents, but this was a very interesting book. This man led quite an interesting life, from what I've gathered. And it was very compelling to read, at least up to the meager page that I made it to. This is indeed another book that if anybody wishes to hear read aloud, I would be more than happy to. I'll read the first page, I think. Life in Virginia before the war, and he means the Civil War. Before spinning the yarn of my 40 years in the Navy, it seems only proper that I should give a short history of my life before entering the service. I was born in Floyd County, Virginia, August the 18th, 1846. My father, Samuel Andrew Jackson Evans, medical doctor, was a graduate of the University of Virginia and named me his first son after Dr. Robley Dunglison, who had been his instructor and dear friend. The home of my parents was in the mountains of Virginia, which, at the time of my birth, were almost as wild and rough as the partially settled mountains of the West. And many would argue they are still that wild today. We did not have savage Indians to contend with, but we did have their savage white brothers. He is quite obviously talking about West Virginians. As a means of livelihood, my father followed his profession of medicine, and he was the only doctor in a circuit of 20 or 30 miles. For pleasure, he owned slaves and farmed, and when requested to do so, represented his constituents in the state legislature. The life of a doctor under such conditions was a very hard one, particularly in the winter season. Frequently, he had to be in the saddle all night, facing the storms of snow and rain to help some sufferer who could only offer his thanks as pay, for most of the people were very poor. It was this exposure that finally cost my father his life in the prime of his manhood and usefulness. So if anybody is interested in hearing more from Captain Robley D. Evans, please please let me know in the comments. This is a extremely dry book in topic and delivery. As the title says, it covers the principles of maritime strategy in the, I believe, pre-Dreadnought days. Published by Longmans, Green and Company, London and New York in 1911. Yeah. So, at the time of publishing, the HMS Dreadnought, I believe, had just entered service. Either it was... No. Let me see. As it so happens, I do have a visual encyclopedia of ships, both of commerce and of war, which we will be delving into after I go over these other two books. Just allow me a second to find the HMS Dreadnought. Der Flieger. Dreadnought. Advent of the Dreadnought. Here we are. This is the HMS Dreadnought, the first warship to consist of a uniform, that is to say, of consistent caliber, main battery of guns, and a fairly uniform secondary battery. Launched in February of 1906. Alright, so I was 2 years off. But this book was written at a time when the HMS Dreadnought had literally just hit the scene. And in those 5 years, naval tactics were changing quite drastically. As before this, before the HMS Dreadnought, most naval battleships or capital ships consisted of a very amalgamous armament. It was not uncommon to find guns of some 5 or 6 different calibers, all being brought to bear on a target, which made accurate fire control almost impossible, as the volume of shell splashes and their similarity to one another made distinguishing what shells fell where a fairly Herculean task. Whereas with the Dreadnought, all main batteries would fire, and you could quite easily gauge where they landed and make adjustments fairly accordingly. But this book was published 5 years after that change, and it shows being an incredibly dry book, and I mean, it is a textbook. It is a difficult read. If anybody is interested in hearing some principles of maritime strategy, please let me know. I do warn you, it is difficult. It will put you to sleep almost immediately. For example, the object of naval warfare must always be directly or indirectly either to secure the command of the sea or to prevent the enemy from securing it. The second part of the proposition should be noted with special care in order to exclude a habit of thought, which is one of the commonest sources of error in naval speculation. That error is the very general assumption that if one belligerent loses the command of the sea, it passes at once to the other belligerent. The most cursory study of naval history is enough to reveal the falseness of such an assumption. It tells us that the most common situation in naval war is that neither side has the command, that the normal position is not a commanded sea, but an uncommanded sea. The mere assertion, which no one denies, that the object of naval warfare is to get command of the sea actually connotes the proposition that the command is normally in dispute. in this state of dispute with which naval strategy is most nearly concerned, for when the command is lost or won, pure naval strategy comes to an end. This truth is so obvious that it would scarcely be worth mentioning were it not for the constant reoccurrence of such phrases as, if England were to lose command of the sea, it would be all over with her. The fallacy of the idea is that it ignores the power of the strategical defense. It assumes that if in the face of some extraordinarily hostile coalition, or through some extraordinary mischance we found ourselves without sufficient strength to keep the command, we should therefore be too weak to prevent the enemy getting it. A negation of the whole theory of war, which at least requires further support than it ever receives. And there you have it. If anybody wants to hear more of this literal textbook, feel free to let me know. Speaking of textbooks, this is a little souvenir of my time in the U.S. Navy. No, I never served long, or very proudly. That's a story I really do not want to get into at all, but I will bring it up on occasion. But this is the Blue Jackets Manual. It is your guide on good seamanship. It is your Bible in the Navy. It is what you refer to all hours of the day. It is what trains you. It is what raises you. Oh, there it is. Great mistakes. Great Lakes. My father served before me in the 80s, and he told me to ask about being sent to Hawaii for boot camp, or RTC, recruit training. But they had since decommissioned or scrapped the Hawaii boot camp. My recruiter actually laughed at me for even bringing it up. But here you can see recruits marching, learning cadence and learning how to march right. But this breaks down literally everything that you will need to essentially thrive, be a model sailor. How to fold, how to eat, how to sleep, how to talk, how to stand, how to breathe. This will train you. Now, in terms of easy boot camps, the Navy is fairly high up there. Here's a chain of command. I'll go over that real quick after I finish my anecdote. The Navy is fairly easy in that regard. It's a fairly benign boot camp. You know, they can't beat the shit out of you. It's not the 70s anymore. Like, they're not gonna come up and like smack you like it's Full Metal Jacket. But you better learn how to shut up, and shut up quick, and learn how to do little things to perfection. If you fuck up, you will get PT'd to death. You will get beaten. That's the way they say it. You will get beaten. You know, your whole division will get beaten. One of the favorites was putting a 5-gallon Homer bucket full of ice in the middle of a compartment, and then PTing you in that compartment until the ice melted. Man. If you join the Marines, you will be getting it a lot worse. One of the things that got a lot of guys through RTC was hearing about how bad the jarheads got it on Paris Island. We'd always say, at least we're not over there. Funnily enough, one of the most common ways to get yourself stepped out or separated and sent home was failing the swim test. Start of the first segment here. Chain of command. The Navy is organized like a pyramid, with the President of the United States at the top as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. there are many levels below the president, eventually leading to you. This is known as the chain of command, and just as you must follow the orders and guidance of your RDCs, they must likewise follow the orders and guidance of the ship's leading chief petty officer, and he or she must follow those of the assistant squadron commander, and so on. Your chain of command will change somewhat each time you report to a new duty station. But while you are at RTC, your chain of command is as follows. At the very top, the President. Below that, the Secretary of the Defense. Below him, the Secretary of the Navy. Below him, Chief of Naval Operations. Below him, Chief of Naval Education and Training. Below him, Commander NSDC. Below him, Commanding Officer RTC. Below him, the Executive Officer RTC or XO. Below him, the Military Training Director. And below him, the Department Head, the Fleet Commander. And below him, the Fleet Leading Chief Petty Officer. Below him, the Group Commander. And then below him, the Ship's Leading Chief Petty Officer. And then below him, the Recruit Division Commanders, the RDCs. Or your drill sergeants, I guess you could say. That's a more common vernacular for people. And then below them is you, the recruit. Here is a detailed schedule. 0500, reveille, wake up, begin morning routine, brush teeth, dress, etc. Shit, shower, shave. Essentially, that's the way it was phrased. You wake up, you shit, you shower, you shave. That's it, you get up. 0545, breakfast. 0600, sick call. Report to sick bay, the medical clinic if you are ill. That was your chance to get beard shits, essentially a piece of paper saying you didn't have to shave every morning. 0700, physical training, stretching, calisthenics, etc. 755, first call to colors, warning that the color ceremony is 5 minutes away. 0800, colors, American flag is ceremoniously hoisted. 820, commence instruction periods. 1100, break for noon meal, lunch. 1200, resume instruction periods. 1230, sick call, report to sick bay if you are ill. 1630, evening meal. 5 minutes before sunset, first call to colors, warning that the evening color ceremony is 5 minutes away. Sunset, evening colors, American flag is ceremoniously lowered. 1800, 6 p.m. Commence night routine, shower, study, work on uniforms, etc. 2200, taps, end of day, turn in for night. And then you got, watch duty and all that. I was quite consistently given a dog watch or a shit watch because I snored. But if anybody wants to learn what it takes to become a seaman, feel free to let me know in the comments. But that brings us to the main event. A visual encyclopedia of ships, both naval and otherwise. Well, mainly naval warships. There are a handful of commerce and commerce ships and liners and all that, but it mainly just covers warships. But this book truly starts at the very beginning of it all, starting at some 3200 BC with early ships. Archaeology shows that boats made from bundled reeds were among the earliest craft, and the building technique developed both in Egypt and South America. But wooden vessels, first of hollowed-out logs like a dugout canoe, then of planking, are also of great antiquity. The origins of the sail and oars also date far back into prehistory. Here's a Egyptian reed boat. Trees were scarce in ancient Egypt, but tall papyrus trees were plentiful in the Nile Delta, and this form of boat construction goes back at least to 3200 BC. The steering oar is already in evidence. The lifespan of a reed boat was a few months at most, but they were quick and cheap to construct. Here we have a Nile barge. Substantial loads. I got nothing to say about that phrasing. Were carried in specialized craft, like this one designed to transport obelisks. Pictured there, it's like a big, or a little Washington monument. Transport obelisks downriver from Aswan to Luxor. I stayed there before. The casino, not the Egyptian city. The Luxor is honestly a pretty sick place to stay. I highly recommend it. It could take 2 at a time. Unpowered, it was controlled by 4 steering oars and towed by 27 small oared vessels. Ropes were used to help support the huge structure. Very interesting. And it kind of just cruises along through the ancient era. But here we have some early medieval ships. By 1200, this was becoming an old world design, though some ships now had 2 masts, as illustrated, and so harnessed greater wind power. Mediterranean ships were caravel built or carvel built, planks meeting edge to edge without overlap, the alternate being clinker built, which is an overlapping plank, like shingles. The bow and stern platforms suggest that this vessel was built with fighting in mind. I wish it would go more into the history of where these designs were found, because that wording suggests that this vessel was built with fighting in mind, implies that something of this plan was found sometime, somewhere, and I feel that would be an interesting thing to explore. But there are bifolds in this book as well, and they kind of skipped ahead here quite a ways, which I'm not like a massive fan of, if I'm honest. Like, it really just blows by ancient history and the age of sail in a lot of ways. Oh, fuck it, I can't skip past good old HMS Victory. Victory, not put into commission until 1778. Victory was always an admiral's flagship, for Jervis at Cape St. Vincent in 1797, and most memorably for Nelson. Excuse me, hold on, let me get into character. Not put into commission until 1778. Victory was always an admiral's flagship, for Jervis at Cape St. Vincent in 1797, and most memorably for Nelson at Trafalgar on 21st of October 1805. Victory took heavy punishment, but survived to bear Nelson's body back to England. God bless him. refitted, it served as flagship in the Baltic till 1812. It is the oldest warship still in commission. Laid down in 1759 at Chatham Dockyard and launched in 1765, Victory, a first rate of 100 guns, was not put into commission until 1778, when France allied herself with the American colonists. Nelson was shot. A terrible business that. During the decisive victory at Trafalgar, it went on to serve as flagship for Admiral. What the fuck is that? Soromez. Admiral Soromon in the Baltic. Secondary armament, 28 24-pounders, the same number of 12-pounders and 16 6-pounder. 6-pounder guns completed the triple-tiered array. Typically they're arranged with the heaviest guns furthest down toward the keel, furthest to the waterline for balancing purposes. And as the name does suggest, that does indicate the weight of projectile that was shot from the gun. So a 24-pounder would be able to fire a 24-pound iron ball, essentially. Yeah. Great cabin. Well, there were other types of guns as well. That's not my specialty. I know precious little about Age of Sail, and honestly ships in general. I'm not really that learned on the subject. I do follow this to a degree, but my specialty is mainly boilers and, you know, steam propulsion. My father served on the Midway and was he wasn't in Gen 1, that was my coworker. My coworker was on Gen 1 in the Midway. My father, I think, was actually in the engine room. Like the main engine room, one of them, and was a machinist mate there. And he told me a little bit about how these worked, and the interest kind of grew, you know. Not just for steam propulsion, but like power generation in general. Let me get back into character here. When I get to the modern boilers and all that, I think I'll draw a diagram and see how you guys enjoy that. Great cabin. This was divided into 3 units. Admiral's day cabin, dining room, and sleeping cabin. Cannons could be installed for battle. Copper plating. The Royal Navy began copper sheathing below the waterline in 1761. It made a major difference to ship performance and lifespan. Yeah, that's mainly because the plating you would want something that would help prevent, like you put a piece of iron plating in seawater without coating it in any way. The seawater will eat away at it. Same with wood, just bare wood. Anything like marine painting is specially designed to keep marine life at bay. Barnacles are a big issue, little parasites like that. And if you coat the bottom in raw iron, it'll galvanize and it'll like eat away quicker. With copper, it kind of takes that brunt, and you know, it takes the brunt away from the wood. I forget exactly what copper does differently, as it is conductive. That has something to do with it, but it reacts well in seawater. Primary armament. A pair of massive 68-pounder and 28 42-pounder guns were carried to provide the basis of Victory's firepower. That's pretty insane. Imagine firing a 68-pound ball of steel at somebody. It's like firing a 10-year-old out of a cannon. The galley was equipped with 2 big stew pots, 2 bread ovens, a grate for grilling or roasting, and a fresh water condenser. Now that freshwater condenser is something I really do want to look into. After hearing about it just now, that's very interesting. Because one of the biggest problems on a ship was enough fresh water. Crew accommodation. Warrant officers and midshipmen had their own ward rooms. Sailors slept in hammocks slung above the guns. That's something that really hasn't changed. Accommodation in a warship is never comfortable. For example, the USS Massachusetts, a lot of the hammocks and racking was temporary, where at night a lot of it would just be strung up wherever, and a lot of the racks just simply folded down. And the ones that didn't were just simple cloth or canvas, stretched with springs on the outside. Racking in more modern carriers and warships, they're not ideal. They're like bunks slotted into the hull with like a pretty thin mattress. Better than it was, but nothing compared to an actual bed. Sail area. Victory's 33-meter, 108.24 foot bowsprit was virtually a fourth mast. The ship's total sail area was 58,555 square feet, which is insane to think about. So let's skip ahead a little bit to some fairly interesting warships, cruisers of the 1880s and 1890s. And nobody really likes talking about this weird in-between era of warship. For some reason, I find it extremely fascinating, of when technology was coming from the age of sail in the early 1800s quite rapidly into the steam-powered, ironclad and iron-hulled warship. And I find it very interesting, really, in those transitional years, to see fairly insane designs being brought about, like the Gorgon, like coastal defense ships with these hilariously low freeboards that quite literally could not move out of the safety of a harbor because they would get swamped immediately. Or these fucking crackhead insane ships, the Novgorod and the Popov, designed by Admiral Popov. Novgorod was circular in form. So let me get my notebook. So a normal ship, a regular ship, right, has a hull that looks from the side like this, right, like that. Everybody's seen it. Looks like a big knife or a wedge. And as you can tell here, the Novgorod looks a little off from that. Looks a little squat, a little weird from the top, right? A normal ship's hull follows a fairly regular hull form, right? Something like this, where it tapers off toward the end, has a sharp front, or typically a sharp front to cut through waves, and the whole thing is designed top to bottom to where it's a blend of hydrodynamic efficiency and stability as a fighting platform to fire off of, to reduce roll as much as possible and have it less affected by waves in that capacity. Admiral Popov found that it was more efficient and more stable gun platform the more you reduced the beam, reduced the length of a ship and increased the beam. Essentially, the more circular you made a ship, it was more efficient, I believe, with a certain engine power somehow, and it was a more stable platform. essentially had better seakeeping with a circular hull form, and it worked to a degree. He designed the Tsar's yacht, like a pleasure yacht, with this in mind, and it wasn't as pronounced. The Tsar's yacht had a normal looking hull, right, but it had like this round protrusion on either side, and that allowed it to have better seakeeping properties, and I believe it allowed it to be fairly efficient with the engine. I think the main thing was the seakeeping. I may be adding that other part on, but if you want to know more, please research this yourself. I am not an expert, but Popov took this design with the Tsar's approval after designing the yacht, and he made something that looked like this. He made something that looked like that, with a central turret that could move a full 360 degrees around, and it had virtually no bow, no stern. And there are fairly amusing stories of this ship being so hopeless that it would simply spin around in circles. Well, that isn't quite true. The amount of control authority that the rudder had over the ship, mainly because there was no defined prow, no designated front of the ship. It was all just circular. The rudder had a lot of trouble actually steering this thing, because believe it or not, a lot of what helps a ship actually turn is the fact that it's cutting through the waves, and you're influencing that cutting motion. If it's just a fucking disc, that's a little bit difficult. And just like with some aerodynamic principles, like say adverse yaw, right? The bow helps push back against the rudder's control, right? So with adverse yaw, what that is when one aileron comes up, one comes down, right? And that creates drag on the opposite wing, which creates a yawing effect on the craft, which is why planes have the V-stab, the stabilizer in the rear, to help control that with rudder input as well. You can think of that rudder input like having a bow and a keel and a defined keel and a bow, which helps counteract that rudder. So without that, the ship would just fucking spin. And it wasn't even good at seakeeping. Like, they were nearly lost. The Popov and the Novigrad were quite nearly lost in not even that heavy seas. With a longitudinal structure supporting a barbette that hosed the two heavy guns. The two Popovkas of this type were built in sections, the parts then being assembled. Two of these 6 propellers were later removed after the vessel was scrapped, and the vessel was scrapped around 1900. There are wonderful videos that go into detail about these ill-fated craft. Drekkenefel is great about naval history, and he's kind of where I get a lot of my information from. But they were fairly stable gun platforms, I will give them that, and that was the main goal. But as you can see, this book does also cover passenger liners. I wonder if it has the side wheel steamer that sunk in the North Atlantic. Oh, yep, there it is. The SS Atlantic. A paddle steamer over the Collins Line. The Arctic left the UK for New York with 246 passengers and 135 crew on the 21st of September, 1854. On the 27th, in thick fog, it collided with the French steamer Vesta. Holed in 3 places, the Arctic sank and 322 people drowned, including the wife and children of the line's owner. The Arctic was a particularly awful shipwreck, a true horror story of one, and if I do remember correctly, this is one where the crew almost mutinied, or they did mutiny at the end, and pretty much just took off with all the lifeboats and all that, and pretty much went around stealing everything and having their way with the woman on board. And look up the story of the SS Arctic with trepidation. It is not for the lighthearted. And here we are, early submarines. I think we can spare some time to go over these nautical misfits. Submersible ships had been contemplated for years before the technology became sufficiently advanced for serious experiments to be made. As with many other forms of mechanical progress, the work of inventors was inspired by the demands of warfare. Here was the perfect stealth ship, if only it could be made to work. Here we have the Turtle. The Turtle was built by David Bushnell. It was the first submarine to be used in action. It was also the first screw-propelled vessel, driven by hand crank. I do not envy that man they put in that tub, with a vertical screw for downward thrust. The external charge was attached to the target by an auger screwed into its hull. Turtle was destroyed to prevent capture by the British. It was launched in 1776. Interesting. El Isidro. I don't know, I don't speak Spanish. Anticipating later submarines in shape, this craft also had a double hull. The engine was designed to operate when submerged, with a chemical conversion plant to supply oxygen. That's actually a fairly interesting. A compressed air pump operated the ballast tanks. The technology was too far ahead of the time and proved unreliable in service. Yeah, I was about to say, this sounds like a very modern submarine with a double hull. And if nobody has actually seen a submarine and how the hull is structured, it's fairly interesting, where you will typically have an internal pressure vessel, which is the part that's pressurized, internally, and is generally designed to be easy to do so. Whereas the exterior of a submarine, this shell that you see being just that, a shell designed to be hydrodynamic first. Alright, you got your propulsion through there or whatever. So essentially you have a double hull, an external hull, which provides the hull form, and an internal hull, which is pressurized and contains the living compartments and propulsion and equipment. I gotta read this one off here. The Intelligent Whale. The Union Navy's first submarine was built to conquer Confederate vessels of the same type. The cigar-shaped hull had a trap door that let mine planters exit to secure mines to the hulls of enemy vessels. The project was abandoned in 1872. An Intelligent Whale was put on display at the Washington Navy Yard. Excuse me. Fenian ram. Fenian. For those of you who don't know, the Fenians were a Irish Republican subgroup that was very prevalent in the mid-1800s. mid to late 1800s. They actually invaded Canada from the US twice. Fenian history is quite ridiculous and fairly convoluted, and I am not the person who you want to be talking about Fenian history because I know very little about it, but I do want to learn about this. Built in New York. Before I get into it, the Fenians' grand idea originally was to raise an Irish Republican army in the United States and then ship them back to Ireland to fight the British. A noble goal, as I do believe that Ireland belongs to the Irish, all of it, North and Republican Ireland. Built in New York for the Fenian Society, the vessel was towed to New Haven in 1883. Never used as a warcraft, it was exhibited at Madison Square Gardens in 1916 in order to raise funds for the Irish uprising that took place that year. It is housed in West Side Park, New York. And you can see quite slowly but surely submarines' hulls taking on a more recognizable profile. Good old Delfino up there. Torpedo boats are another fairly interesting idea. Literally a very small and sometimes quick craft designed for one thing, well, two things: to be expendable and to launch torpedoes. I wish I could get more into some of this, but I do want to move along a little bit. By the way, if you do enlist into the Army, not the Army, the Navy, do not get scammed into enlisting on a submarine. One of the very common ways, one of the common things that you will hear from recruiters is, you know, on a submarine, you eat as good as an officer. What they don't tell you is that as opposed to a regular warship, where there is a standard of food for regular enlisted men, and then a standard of food for officers, on a submarine, they can't afford to do that, so everybody eats the same shit. You don't eat better on a submarine. The officers eat worse on a submarine. That is something I do not recommend. And here it is, the trendsetter itself, the HMS Dreadnought. With the appearance of Dreadnought, a more advanced era of warship construction began, as well as a British-German arms race. The first all-big gun capital ship, it made previous battleships obsolete. Every navy now had to have dreadnoughts. Dreadnought was scrapped in 1923, by which time it itself was obsolete. Dreadnought was the first battleship of her era to have a uniform main battery, rather than having a few large guns complemented by a heavy secondary battery of somewhat smaller guns. Normally it would go like 2 12-inch guns and like 3 or 4 10-inch guns or something crazy like that, or like maybe another couple 10-inch guns, and then like I don't know, 5 8-inch guns, and then like 10 5-inch guns, shit like that, all the way down to like 2-inchers. Pre-dreadnoughts were a crazy time, and I find them honestly a lot more interesting to learn about than post-dreadnought battleships. Dreadnought was the fastest battleship in the world at the time of its completion, able to make 21.6 knots. Accommodation. In contrast to previous custom, officers were accommodated in the forward part of the ship and seamen toward the stern. I'll come back to the machinery because I want to draw out to you guys, because that's more what I'm familiar with, how the machinery operated magazines. Shells were stored inside heavy armor plating and raised by hoist to the gun turrets. 8 could be fired in a simultaneous broadside. The hull. Its ram was a modest one, but the dreadnought rammed and sank the German U-29 in the North Sea in March of 1915. It possessed a range of some 6,620 nautical miles at 10 knots, or 4,910 nautical miles at 18.4 knots. I'm not going to list out how many kilometers that is. That is indeed the rest of the world's problem that they use the metric system. I refuse to learn it. The armament. To bolster the anti-torpedo defenses, 12-pounder guns were mounted on the armored main turrets for use against torpedo boats. Fire control. Electrical transmission of range finding and deflection information from the spotting top to the gun turrets vastly improved the gun's effectiveness. And the machinery. 18 Babcock and Wilcox 3-drum water tube boilers supplying steam to the Parsons direct drive turbines. Engines developed 22,500 shaft horsepower. Now this one uses a direct drive turbine. That's a little bit different than what you might find in a more modern ship. Let's see if they have a cutaway of something like that. Oh, an interesting aside. The IJN Haruna is one that my great-grandfather served on in the Second World War. The Haruna was one of the first dreadnought-type warships to be built in a Japanese yard in 1927 to 1928. After a major refit, it was reclassified as a battleship. The 3 funnels were reduced to 2. New boilers were installed and the armor increased. It was sunk by U.S. aircraft in July of 1945 and it was broken up in 46. Yeah, he survived the war, by the way. He did not, he didn't die in the Haruna. He passed away amongst family. But my great-grandfather did indeed serve on that very ship, the IJN Haruna. Let me... Deutschland, do they have a cutaway of like an actual cool battleship or something? It doesn't really say much about the propulsion. Yeah, these cutaways do not really go too much into the propulsion system, which is unsurprising. Okay, here we go though. On the Scharnhorst, 12 Wagner 3-drum boilers raised steam for 3 Brown Bovary geared turbines with a maximum power output of 161,000 shaft horsepower. Now what is being described? After I draw out a ship's power plant, I think I'll call the video quits, but to start things off, you begin with a boiler. Now, most boilers essentially resemble something like this, right? And when they say water tube or fire tube, essentially what that means is a boiler on the inside. At least some of the more common industrial ones you will see resemble, if you look at it from the direct side, they will look like this, with a cap on either end, and from the front, with the cap removed, you'll see that a boiler is, in essence, a chamber, a main chamber, with a bunch of smaller rods going through it, and whether or not it is water or heat going through those rods, it is classified as a water tube or a fire tube. In the case of most shipboard boilers, they are water tube. In the case of a lot of industrial boilers, they're a fire tube. So in the case of a fire tube boiler, this entire case on the back, this entire case, right, is a jacket, a big water jacket, where water is stored in, you know, up to the top and steam is taken off. But these tubes traveling through the main compartment of the boiler, right? You've got the main fire tube, and it hits the back cap, and the fire is then routed through these secondary tubes, these smaller tubes, through the water jacket. And that's what heats the water to steam and is taken off to heat a building or whatever in a fire tube or a water tube boiler. This box is the firing box. You've got your fire box at the bottom where fuel is added, in this case oil. Oil is burnt at the bottom. You've got fire down here, and on the inside you've got the water tank, the main water tank, up to a secondary expansion tank where the water is heated and feeds this upper tank. So you've got water here, it goes up, gets heated, and into here it's where you've got water down here and it's heated. The water travels up, and in here it turns to steam, saturated steam. That is to say, steam with water still in it, water vapor. So that would be the steam you'd see boiling off of a pot, right? It's still visible to the eye. Then the steam would then be routed into a superheater. Essentially, it's brought back into the boiler. Right, it's routed up and then back into the boiler, where the steam is vented into this superheater, whereas the exhaust gases of the fire passes over these main water tubes. It heats the water to steam, and then the exhaust, since the funnel is the exhaust, is essentially pulling the boiler's exhaust is pulling the fire's exhaust gases up and out through the funnel. That hot exhaust gas is routed over a secondary heater, the superheater, which turns that saturated steam, the visible steam with the water vapor still in it, into a superheated steam, anything over about 300 degrees. A lot of these operated somewhere at like the 500 to 600 degree range, I think. I'm not 100%. You'd have to ask my father about that. But this superheated steam was then collected and piped off to your turbines. And essentially they would look like big turbochargers, essentially like a big centrifugal blower. Well, not really. No. They kind of did. It's like, if you've seen like a jet engine, it's like that. And this steam would be vented over, you know, a bunch of blades, a bunch of rotors, right, on a central shaft. See, this is the central shaft, and you have these rotors, right, all angled, all vaned, and you'd have your primary high pressure turbine, where the steam is brought initially to power it. And that's sent through. The steam is then scavenged, typically for a low pressure turbine. Like, just imagine like a jet engine, right? Where all it is just angled rotors, right? You have a central cone. They've got like fucking fins on it, right? A lot of small vanes, and that spins the shaft. And then the shaft is geared to a low pressure turbine. So you're getting every last bit of energy out of that steam. And that low pressure steam is vented off from the main high pressure turbine to the low pressure one. And then back through to like condensers, where the steam is converted back into usable water to be used again in the whole cycle. You wouldn't be able to use seawater for this. At least not for very long, as all the debris in seawater would quickly clog these very, very fine water tubes. I'm talking like they're tiny little tubes, if you've ever seen them, and they're very vulnerable to lime scaling, clogging them, and essentially creating a explosion hazard. But these big turbines, right, the shafts, why they call them a geared turbine. In the Dreadnought, it was called a direct drive turbine. So this, call this high pressure turbine, right, will be connected to a shaft, and in a direct drive scenario, that shaft would just simply go back to the propeller, right, your propeller, and that would drive the ship directly. In a geared turbine setup, so you got your high pressure turbine 1 into low pressure turbine 1, and then that would go into a, when I say massive, I am dead serious, a massive gear reduction. I'm talking something probably the size of a small house, and all it is a massive case full of reduction gears, like a transmission, right? So you'd have your main shaft that the gears would run on, and essentially they would, it would reduce, right? Because you're spinning this shaft at like some fucking multiple tens of thousands of RPM, right? And need a way to reduce that to a usable RPM output to the propeller. So it run through a massive set of gear reduction, massive gear reduction box. Like think of a transfer case on a truck, except instead of a transfer case taking input from one end and converting it out the sides with a gear reduction, this is a straight gear reduction. So you take 22,000 RPM at a set amount of power and convert it down to like, I don't know, 1,000 or 2,000 RPM at the output for the propeller. Because if you spin a propeller at 22,000 RPM in water, you would run into cavitation and ruin the propeller. And quite frequently, these gear reduction boxes were the size of a house and were quite frequently not even owned by the Navy or the ship. They were rented because they were so expensive. The outright cost of buying one of these units was not feasible, so they would be rented, maintained, and then returned. If anybody wants, I can try and get my father to explain some of those principles of naval boilers a bit better than me, or I could get a refresher from him and be able to explain it to you in more detail. But on that note, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and remember, we're all in it together. I'm pulling for you.